Hello and welcome. Today I bring you to Beyond Stigma and Criminalization, the role of social workers in supporting sex workers. This presentation examines how social workers can support sex workers without reproducing stigma or assuming that every client has the same experience. I will focus on the relationships between sex work, discrimination, and mental health, while also examining the strengths and limitation of existing research. The presentation concludes with practical language and advocacy strategies for social work practice. When you see these images, what do you think? Empowerment, exploitation, choice, victimization, poverty, danger? What do we assume when we hear sex work? Popular images often reduce sex work to a few familiar narratives. Some portray it as glamorous, others portray it as empowering. Some might portray it as all sex workers are victims who need to be rescued. Both approaches can prevent social workers from listening to the individual client. But before we go on discussing more about research, we need to examine the assumptions we may be bringing into assessment and treatment. So we want to continue moving beyond the stereotype. Sex workers are not a single uniform population. Experiences differ by setting to setting, type of work, gender, race, class, immigration status, disability, housing, and criminalization. A client may experience agency and vulnerability at the same time. And we're going to be discussing one study, and we're going to be discussing a few studies, but one of them is connected to 26 low and middle income countries. These populations differed by location, legal context, type of work, and social conditions. A client may have made meaningful choices about their work and still experience violence, discrimination, financial pressures, or limited alternatives. Social workers need to hold those realities together rather than forcing the client into a single category. Next, we're going to be talking about language and important distinctions. As you can see here, different words are popping up on the screen: sex work, decriminalization, coercion and violence, trafficking, and survival sex. Accurate language is essential. Consensual adult sex work does not mean trafficking. Mislabeling can lead to loss of autonomy, unnecessary law enforcement involvement, or failure to identify actual danger. Stigma and criminalization frequently conflate sex work with trafficking, hindering access to justice and support services. So next, we're going to be talking about one of the studies that was created by Beatty and their colleagues. This is a systemic review and meta-analysis of quantitative research on female sex workers in low and middle income countries. Their review included 68 papers representing 56 unique studies and nearly 25,000 participants across 26 countries. The study examined several mental health outcomes and their associates with violence, alcohol and drug use, condom use, HIV, and sexually transmitted diseases. Findings from the international review. The review found substantial levels of reported mental health problems. The pooled estimated for depression was 41.8%, while psychological distress was estimated at 40.8%. The review also reported pool estimated of anxiety, PTSD symptoms, recent suicidal ideation, and recent suicide attempts. These findings demonstrate that mental health needs among female sex workers deserve serious attention. However, prevalence estimates should not be interpreted as evidence that sex work itself is a cause of these conditions. Next, we're going to be talking about what was associated with mental health problems in this study. The strongest pattern in this research concerns overlapping vulnerabilities. Depression was associated with experience of violence, and recent suicide attempt were also associated with violence. Depression was associated with illicit drug use, inconsistent condom use with clients, and HIV. These findings point towards social and occupational conditions that may influence mental health rather than supporting a simplistic explanation that sex work alone causes depression or trauma. For social workers, this means addressing mental health in context of broader social determinants, such as violence, housing instability, or access to healthcare, rather than isolating it as an individual issue. And next, we're going to be talking about the strength of this study. So, this article has several important strengths. The researchers used a registered review protocol, searched multiple databases, followed systemic review guidelines, and used independent reviewers to assess eligibility and study quality. The review also included data from 26 countries and almost 25,000 participants. These methods make the article a useful source for identifying broader patterns in international literature. Now, here are some limitations. The limitations are especially important for social work interpretation because in every study, cross-sectionality could come to play, meaning that researchers could identify associations but could not establish what caused what. For example, violence may contribute to depression, but depression may also affect vulnerability to violence or help seeking. Many studies use Many study use purposive or responded derived samples which may not represent all sex workers. The research also used different mental health instruments and cutoff scores, making direct comparisons difficult. Finally, review focused on female sex workers in low and middle income countries, so its findings should not automatically be generalized to all sex workers in the United States or Canada. So next, here still are a few limitations. It's also worth noting that the review included only English language studies, which may have excluded relevant research, and no intervention studies were reviewed, meaning we could not draw conclusions about which programs or supports are more effective for this population. So, what did this study find? They were able to get three different sample sizes from sex workers, food beverage servers, and hairstylists. So, instead of examining sex workers alone, they compared sex workers with two other front life service occupations, food and beverage serving and hairstyling. The study included participants in Victoria, British Columbia, Sacramento, California. Because the study had two waves of data collection, it was better positioned than a single cross-sectional study to examine whether earlier conditions were associated with the latter depression scores. The sex workers in the study reported higher average depression scores, more discrimination, lower self-worth, and greater material hardships than the comparison group. When discrimination was added to the statistical model, the association between sex work and depression became smaller. This suggests that discrimination may help explain part of the relationship between sex work and depression. Findings supports the findings support a social determinant perspective. Mental health outcomes are shaped by how institutions and other people treat workers. So, next, we're going to be talking about the strengths and limitations of another study by Benoit and his colleagues. And this study was done in 2015. So, a major strength of this study is the comparison group. Comparing sex workers with servers and hairstylists helps show the emotional labor, customer mistreatment, and low occupational status. So, the next study that we'll be looking at is Benoit and his colleagues in 2015 used a different research design. Instead of examining sex workers alone, they compared sex workers with two other frontline service occupation, food and beverage serving and hairstyling. The study included participants in Victoria, British Columbia, and Sacramento, California. Because the study had two waves of data collection, it was better positioned than a single cross-sectional study to examine whether earlier conditions were associated with later depression scores. The sex workers, my bad, the sex workers in this study reported higher average depression scores, more discrimination, lower self-worth, and greater material hardships than the comparison group. When discrimination was added to the statistical model, the association between sex work and depression became smaller. This suggests that discrimination may help explain part of the relationship between sex work and depression. The findings support a social de- the finding supports a social determinants perspective. Mental health outcomes are shaped by how institutions and other people treat workers. So next, we'll be seeing this study's strengths and limitations. So, major strength of this study is the comparison group. Comparing sex workers with servers and hairstylists helps show that emotional labor, customer mistreatment, and low occupational status are not unique to sex work. Even though sex work carries more intense stigma, the study also measured discrimination through experiences such as being denied housing or financial services and being treated disrespectfully by healthcare providers. Its inclusion of sex work narratives that adds context to the statistical results alone could not provide. The study also has limitations. The data was collected more than a decade before publication, so the fundings may not reflect current forms of online, independent, or platform-based sex work. The sample came also from only two cities and cannot represent all sex workers. The researchers also noted graded loss to follow up among sex workers. In addition, the study focused on workers with direct physical contact with customers, which excludes some forms of sex work. Importantly, the findings show relationship among variables. They do not prove that sex work itself causes depression. So now we will be comparing the two studies. These studies answer different questions. Benoit and his colleagues provide a closer examination of discrimination and depression within a comparative sample. Beatty and their colleagues provide a broader international summary of mental health outcomes. Neither study should be treated as a complete description of sex work or sex workers. Taken together, though, they suggest that mental health is influenced by intersecting social conditions, but they also show why we need more longitudinal, community informed, and intervention focused research. So, next, we will be talking about what is missing from these studies. Both articles point to gaps in the evidence. Beatty and their colleagues found no mental health intervention studies in their review. Their review also showed major variations in sampling and measurements. Benoit and their colleagues demonstrated the value of studying discrimination, but their sample is geographically narrow and relatively old. Future research should include people with diverse identities and work arrangement, involving sex workers in designing the research, and examine whether changes in the law and policy improve safety and mental health. So, how does sex intersect with this, right? An intersectional approach prevents us from treating stigma as a single experience. The effects of criminalization and discrimination may be intensified for someone who is also radicalized, transgender, undocumented, disabled, unhoused, parenting, or using substances. Benoit and his colleagues found that sex work sample included more racial and sexual minorities and greater material hardships than the comparison group. Beatty and their colleagues similarly describe overlapping vulnerabilities involving poverty, violence, substance use, HIV, and stigma. Social workers should assess how these symptoms interact in the client's actual life. So let's look into it. How to recognize implicit bias. So, implicit bias can appear in the questions that we ask, the referrals that we offer, the information we document, and the risk we emphasize. A social worker may unintentionally assume that every client wants to exit sex work or that every client is being coerced. The opposite assumption can also be harmful if it causes the practitioner to overlook violence or exploitation. The NASW, the National Association of Social Work Code of Ethics, calls on social workers to engage in critical self reflection, understand their own biases, and recognize clients as experts of their own lives. Reflective practice requires asking whether our response would change if the client described another form of work. So, let's see what we can do instead, right? These questions do not avoid safety concerns. They make it more likely that a client will answer honestly. A social worker can ask about threats, control, violence, debt, restricted movements, withheld documents, and the ability to leave without assuming the answer. The client's goals should guide the conversation unless there's an imminent safety concern or a legal duty to report. So for here, we can see asking, are you being trafficked? We can use instead, I'm assessing for safety. Do you feel safe at work and at home? Why do you do this? We can use, is there anything regarding work that brought you here today? And was this a way of continuing to use or continuing using? If you don't mind sharing, what led you towards this profession at the time? These all can be different ways we can ask without having it be too invasive or too overwhelming for the client. So now let's assess, right? A trauma informed assessment recognizes risk without defining the client only by the risk. Social workers should ask what is happening, what the client wants, what resources are available, and what barriers make change difficult. If coercion, trafficking, violence, or danger to a minor is disclosed, the practitioner should follow the applicable law and agency policy while explaining confidentiality and its limits as clearly as possible. So, what can we do as social workers? Social work advocacy occurs at several levels. At the individual level, practitioners can provide respectful assessments and referrals. At the organizational level, they can challenge intake forms, confidentiality practices, and policies that exclude sex workers. At the policy level, they can support decriminalization, labor protections, access to healthcare, housing, and legal services. Advocacy for decriminalization does not mean ignoring exploitation. It means reducing policies that make it harder for people to report violence or obtain help. So now we're going to be looking into some lived experiences, and I use the book of Belle de Jour, The Diary of an Unlikely Call Girl, Um, a first person narrative can add a huge human dimension to the quantitative research cannot provide. So, this memoir may help us examine how sex work is described, concealed, interpreted, or judged. However, one memoir is not evidence of what all sex workers experience. I would use the quotation as an illustration of lived experiences, not as proof of a general pattern. The research articles provide broader evidence, while the memoir helps us reflect on the voice, representation, and the danger of treating any single story as universal. So, what this all means for our social work practice? The research points to three clear directions. First, on the question of policy, the evidence supports decriminalization as the model most likely to reduce violence and improve access to health services. It is important to distinguish this from legalization or the Nordic model, both which continue to carry risk for sex workers themselves. Platt and their colleagues found in 2018 that decriminalization has the strongest association with safety and healthcare access among the models studied. Second, social workers have a concrete role in harm reduction advocacy. This means supporting policies that create safer working conditions, things like access to condoms, safe physical spaces, and peer outreach programs. Benoit and colleagues reminds us that many of the risks of sex workers face are structural, meaning that they are shaped by policy and environment, not by the work itself. And third, when we provide direct services, trauma informed care requires us to locate the source of distress accurately. Beatty and their colleagues found that violence and stigma, not sex work itself, are often the primary drivers of mental health struggles in this population. That distinction should shape every assessment and every intervention we offer. So let's practice. What can you ask? The client here says, I work independently, but recently experienced violence from a client. I do not want to contact the police. I need help with housing and anxiety. This case illustrates how social workers can respond without forcing the client into a victim or criminal category. The first step is to listen and clarify the client's goals. The worker can assess immediate danger, provide options for healthcare and legal support, discussing housing resources, and explore anxiety symptoms. The worker should explain confidentiality and its limits rather than threatening to call police or assuming that law enforcement is the client's preferred solution. As always, when in doubt, consult. It's okay to recognize your own feelings that might come up. Stay present, keep an empathetic ear, and remember that our clients are the experts of their life. Take care of yourself after a session as well. So, beyond pathology, strength, and agency, the final point I want to make is the one that research on marginalized populations sometimes misses entirely, and that is the strength. Sex workers are not a passive population waiting to be rescued or treated. They organize communities, create peer safety networks, and actively advocate for their own rights and recognitions. Fowler's 2023 work documents this collective agency and highlights how peer led organizing has been central to harm reduction efforts globally. Benoit and their colleagues also found that many sex workers report genuinely positive aspects of their work, including financial independence, flexibility, and a sense of empowerment. These experiences do not erase the very real risk we have discussed today, but they do remind us that a strength-based lens is not just aspirational, it's accurate. As social workers, our job is to see the whole person. That means holding space for both the structural vulnerabilities and the agency's resilience, resilience, and self determination that exists alongside them. So, here are our key takeaways, right? Don't equate sex work for trafficking. Don't equate sex work for empowerment or victimhood. Mental health outcomes are shaped by overlapping social conditions. Research findings must be interpreted with attention to design and sampling. Ask open, respectful, safety-focused questions. Center client goals, autonomy, and dignity. And last but not least, advocate, advocate, advocate against stigma and criminalization. The important lesson is that as a social worker, we should never romanticize nor condemn sex work. We should understand the evidence, recognize its limitations, assess for safety and coercion, and respect the client's goals. A non-judgmental approach is not passive. It allows us to identify actual harm more accurately and advocate for services and policies that make clients safer. And here are the references that were used for today's presentation. Thank you so much for being here and listening, and I hope you gained some insight on how you can better serve our sex work population. Thank you.